Hi, friends. Well, welcome to this video to introduce our next set of readings for our next class when we gather. For these assignments, we're going to be looking at three different texts written by a fairly diverse group of women. And we're doing this for a couple of reasons. First of all, we need a palate cleanser after the readings in Hauerwas and Yoder, and we want to begin to turn towards the creation of a positive ethic and to begin to consider what an actual Christian ethic would look like. And so, what we're going to be doing from here on out in this course is we're going to be hearing from more women, from more people of color, hopefully, and from more people that are not part of the Western European United States sort of realm. And the reason we're doing that is because an ethic from the perspective of powerful white males is at best a very highly incomplete ethic. And as we saw the last time when we looked at Hauerwas and Yoder, can be very unethical. The first thing we're looking at is a sermon. It's from this book. It's a book of women's preaching, primarily from throughout the UK. And the sermon is, the title of it is called Blaming Eve by a woman named Janet Lees. And this is one of those sermons that shows us what sermons can be. What a really wonderful, rich sermon looks like. And it reveals to us a beginning movement within ethics, which is that we become people who are responsible for our actions. And so, what I want us to do, I'm also going to send along the scripture texts just in case you don't have them handy, although I would strongly encourage you to actually read them from your Bible. Because the act of seeking those texts, of reading them in their context, seeing them in that way, is actually a really helpful way of reading and thinking about just experiencing those texts. But I'll send the scriptures just in case you don't have them handy. One of the things that we want to see in this reading is to think about an ethics of Scripture. In particular, how do we challenge our scriptures? How do we read and reinterpret those scriptures? The presenting issue in this sermon is the issue of sexism, the limitation of the role of women that shows up in the readings in Genesis, in Timothy, and the question is, what parts of this do we emphasize? Do we emphasize the limitation and the constraint that the Pauline school presents here? Or do we emphasize the parts of these scriptures that are positively oriented? Traditionally, we've emphasized the negative parts. Women should be silent, should not be part of our, should not have a voice in the church, should not take a full role in the life of the church, a full and equal role in the life of the church. And so part of what I want us to do as we read these is to ask this question: can we consider what positive prescriptions we might find in these passages? That may be challenging given the fact that they've been read so negatively for so much of the existence of the church. But part of what I want us to do is to consider whether or not we can pull something positive out of them, as Janet Lees does in this sermon. So the sermon's there kind of as an example and something that's just, I think, a very refreshing approach to these texts. To go along with that is a more academically focused text that comes from this book. It's not the first time we're going to draw a reading, a chapter from this work, edited by Lois Daly, Feminist Theological Ethics, and we're looking at the opening chapter of this volume by a scholar named Eleanor Humes Haney. called What is Feminist Ethics? And the reason that we are looking at this is there's a couple reasons. First of all, because this ethical voice includes traditionally excluded voices. The writing of ethics was done traditionally by, say, male scholars, because that was predominantly who taught at in university settings, predominantly who was involved in the production of ethics until very, very recently. And so as women gained a firmer footing in the university, as women explored their voice and their scholarship more, we are the beneficiaries of that. Suddenly we have this kind of work. And the question is, what can we learn from the perspectives of people who have been previously excluded from creating ethics? How do we legitimize and reconcile these different forms of ethics? One thing to note when we talk about feminist ethics, and this is going to be, and the idea, we're not just doing this because it's, say, a feminist ethic. We're doing it because this reading and the third one that we're going to look at challenge the received ethics that we have, or the received ways of knowing that we have. The very idea of feminist ethics is something that's subject to challenges because the perspective of women is shaped by their situation. A powerful white university professor who's able to pull together their colleagues, probably a multinational group of people, typically in Western settings. I'm sorry, I'm looking at through the names here. And it looks like it's predominantly Western European, United States, Canada folks. The perspective of the people who are part of this kind of work, they're highly educated, they tend to have a greater degree of wealth and power within society. Probably it's going to lean more white, that sort of thing. A powerful white university professor is unlikely to speak to the situation of a person of color, a woman who is a laborer, who is a poor person who lives in a very poor part of a non-Western city, non-Western country, for example. Their life situation is going to be very different. And it was kind of part of what it is to be feminist, is women started writing about the world in which women inhabit. And then poorer non-Western women began reading those texts and saying, that does not align with us. The third reading we're going to look at is going to come out of that kind of perspective. And the other thing to say is that women are not necessarily feminists. You can be a woman and you can support patriarchal ideals and structures. That's something that happens within the Episcopal Church, within the university, within other places of power. We have women who are in roles of power and authority who are supporting that traditionalist kind of power dynamic that was in place from what happened when wealthy white males ran the thing. In this reading, and this is a fairly, I hope at least, a fairly straightforward reading. It's academic, but it's not like over the top, hard academic work. Again, that's my way of reading it. Your mileage may vary. If you have trouble with the reading, then by all means reach out to me. A couple things I will mention here. There is an implicit critique in this work of the kind of things that Hauerwas and Yoder are trying to do. She names it very explicitly at one point by saying, we cannot return to the original sources, whether that's the New Testament, the Pauline literature that we see in the sermon, We cannot return to the sources of Luther or Calvin. We cannot return to the source that Hauerwas is looking at, which is really the work of Thomas Aquinas, and try to update them and make them come out right, as she says. If it was sexist, if it was racist, if it was classist, whatever it was in the beginning, it's going to remain that now. We can still use those things. They may have some use and utility for us to think about as a means of how we got to where we are, but the initial work is something that is damaging in itself. And so the vision that she is promoting here is really that of what she calls a new community. Maybe a community called church, even. Something that's new from the male-dominated one that Hauerwas and Yoder certainly are offering. The male-dominated one that Plato and Aristotle are offering is, if you watch the last video that we did. And the animating source for this is the experience of women. It's not just the canon of Western civilization texts. That is, the canon that we have from people like Plato and Aristotle, the New Testament writers, and things like that. Part of what they're doing is they're foregrounding what it means to be outside of that kind of culture, that kind of society, the world that was generated by those texts, and asking the question based on the experience of the people who were excluded from that. What kind of ethic should we expect to live with and create? And then the final thing that she talks about is something that I think is exceptionally helpful. She talks about Jesus's teaching being situated in this first century context where he is, in a sense, redefining what it means to seek God, what it means to worship God, what it means to know God. The redefinition at one level is really not a redefinition of God. Like, we as humans don't have the ability to redefine who God is. God is fine in God's self. What we can do, though, is we can redefine how we think about God, how we think about God today, how we think about our relation and understanding to and with God. And so to positively situate, say, the New Testament documents in this regard, we might think about the conversation that Jesus has with the woman at the well, which is one of the texts that animated the sermon that we're looking at. How does that change or reshape our view of God? Where Jesus is violating ethical norms of the day to sit down and talk with this woman that he should not be talking to. How do we think about the Christian tradition as a whole, which is in many respects a redefinition of the Jewish tradition, the Hebrew tradition and understanding of God? Think, for example, of the book of Hebrews or the book of Romans, which radically reinterpret the law, radically reinterpret who God is, the place and position of Moses and some of the other figures within the Hebrew tradition. And then what does it mean for us as Christians today to look at our own received tradition, our own texts, our own ideas and understanding, and subject them to a similar kind of redefinition and change? That's part of what's going on in that text. The third text is a book that I mentioned, I think 2 or 3 sessions ago. And I absolutely butchered her name, which I feel awful about. I think I mistook her with some kind of celebrity of some sort, and that's not ideal. Francois Verges writes this book, A Decolonial Feminism. This is not a religious text, really in any sense of the term, though it deals with some religious issues. It's a political text. And the reason that we're looking at that is because our faith must be affected by the world in which we live, by the world around us. And part of how that happens is we learn from texts that challenge that faith, that challenge the structures of our faith, that challenge the way in which we understand our faith. And this text requires maybe a little bit more introduction than the others, partly because it challenges not just our faith, but some of the foundational parts of American society. The context of this is a workers' strike that took place at Gare du Nord in Paris, which is the busiest railway station in Europe. It sees over 700,000 passengers that travel through there per day. And the presenting issue is the invisibility of the workers who keep that station running. The people who clean the station, who are subjected to dangerous chemicals, to dehumanizing situations, and because of their status, are not really accorded the status of fully human individuals. She'll talk about that some in the reading. We can talk about that more when we gather. The other context of this reading is Verges's setting in Reunion Island, which is partly where she grew up, partly where she worked for a time. Reunion Island is a French colony that's located several hundred miles east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. This island is entirely a product of colonialism and capitalism, which are two things that go together. Each of those animates the other in their own way. It was uninhabited until the 17th century when the French colonized it because it was an ideal it's in an ideal latitude for certain kinds of crops. And so they colonized it, they created these huge plantations, and they inhabited it by first importing African slaves to work on those plantations, and then they brought in indentured servants from other populations that the French considered to be exploitable. And so this island itself, the population of this island, is entirely a product of the exploitation that goes along with certain kinds of capital, certain kinds of colonization. And the questions that are being asked here relate to our study of ethics by zooming out to a global scale to examine the systems and structures that impact people outside the West and that should be of concern to those of us in the West. And so one way to think about this, for example, might be through the production of clothing, which doesn't happen on this island, but it may be an example that we're slightly more familiar with. You think about the circumstances and the situations in which our clothing is produced, often in dangerous factories that lack adequate safety precautions, that have severely negative health impacts for the workers, and that result in us having clothing that are provided for us cheaply and abundantly, and we don't have to think about where it came from and under what circumstances it was produced. All we know is we went to the store and we were able to buy a shirt for $10 that somehow was manufactured across on the other side of the world, was shipped here and provided for us. And we don't know who did it, under what circumstances, or how. Those are the kinds of concerns that are being addressed here. She does use some $10 words. I apologize for that. I don't think it's so many that this is unreadable if you're not a specialist in it. Look them up if you need to. Skip them if you want to. Shoot me an email. If you want to talk about anything, give me a call. I'm happy to talk. A couple of things I will define or talk about a little, just to kind of ease our way into this work. The first thing is that economic systems are not monolithic entities. There are and have been numerous economic systems over the course of human history. Each system takes different forms in different places. Agrarian systems of economics look different in the ancient Near East than they did in hunter-gatherer, say, tribes, or in European settings. They look different than they did in in America as it was being sort of settled and colonized. And in like manner, the capitalisms of the United States or Europe differ in how they're regulated and for whose benefit they are regulated. The communist systems of Russia and China are very different. The systems that we talk about in very broad strokes are just different in different places. The other thing that's really important for us to note here, and that we miss a lot of the time in this country, is that Christianity does not and cannot depend on any particular economic system. And it has thrived under numerous economic systems, just as it's thrived under numerous political systems and structures over its 2,000-year history all across the globe. What we know of as, democracy and capitalism and all this stuff is not Christian in any sense of the word. It's simply the environment in which we live. When she is, and the other thing I'll note, kind of along those lines, is that when she is critiquing the idea of capitalism, it's not the capitalism of, say, small business owners producing and selling goods to feed their family, maybe have a few employees and allow them to feed their families. This is a modern form of capitalism known as neoliberalism. You may or may not have heard that word before on the news or reading about it, something of that nature. The structures of neoliberal capitalism is kind of what we've been working under in the United States and part of Europe since at least the Reagan era. And in this version of capitalism, everything becomes a place that can be commodified, and market forces are used to reshape society. And this happens not just in terms of goods and services, but in terms of public goods, in terms of education, in terms of medicine, in terms of politics, in terms of people themselves. These things are given commodified values that boil down to how market forces can be used to promote certain ways of being in the world and to generate outcomes that tend to increase and concentrate wealth among a small group of people. So, for example, in Indiana, in the area that I used to live, this is what's happening within its education system. We took what was a public education system where public monies were pooled and used to create school districts, buildings, to buy teachers, not to buy them, but to pay for them and, pay their salaries and things like that, that would then be offered to all people regardless of their background, income level, things like that. There were inequalities already built into that tended to run along racial lines, where school districts that were predominantly inhabited by people of color had fewer resources to use than white school districts. In this version of education, though, it goes beyond those kinds of racial and class-based ways of reshaping education. They introduced a private school system that they created from scratch as an alternative to the public school system, and they used public monies, public tax dollars, in order to fund and support those private education systems. And also, the private education systems produced measurably worse results than the public ones. However, one of the things that happened is, since the private education systems that were created were capitalist entities, then it allowed public monies, public tax monies, to be used to create wealth for private investors, for private capitalists. When she's critiquing capital, that is the kind of capital that she is critiquing. And what happened in the area that I come from, they have taken literally millions of dollars away from what was a public education system, and they have given those millions of dollars to wealthy private schools located in wealthy suburban parts of Indianapolis and other large cities. And so it's a way of reshaping society that continues to harm people from certain backgrounds, certain geographic areas, certain places, while privileging people in areas where there's already a lot of wealth, and while enriching people who have enough wealth to, essentially create these private school systems. Another question that Verges addresses that you may or may not be familiar with is an incident, at least, that you may not be familiar with. It kind of relates to what we talked about in the video I sent last week on Plato and Aristotle and power. The question that she asks is, who makes ethical judgments? Who has the right or the authority to make those ethical judgments? And she refers a few different places to the issue of Muslim women wearing veils in French society. In 2010, the French Parliament banned the wearing of veils and face coverings as a sexist sign of the subjugation of women. They said this is an open and free society, and we're going to make it illegal for anything to impinge on that openness. And the problem, of course, is that this ban very narrowly impacted Muslim women. It wasn't just a ban on veils, it included other kinds of head coverings and things like that. But it very narrowly impacted Muslim women, and the idea that they were subjected was news to at least some of the women wearing those veils as part of their religious observance. That's not how they perceived that. That's not what their experience of that use was. And from the outside, as Western, as American people, we might kind of agree with that, to regard the wearing of those veils as something that is indeed harmful, something that is harmful to these women. But from within the logic of the Muslim culture, the people who are wearing that, it's not harmful. At least they don't perceive it as harmful. Now again, we might quibble with that, but the question is this: when an ethical choice is made for us and imposed upon us, or when we make an ethical choice and impose it on other people who are outside of our culture, who are outside of us, then it stands that we have to ask in what sense the choice is an ethical one. Because then it becomes an issue of power and domination, even if it's aimed at something that might seem good on its face. The issues that Verges addresses is in some sense really not about the rightness or wrongness of a given action, but about the systems that create the outcomes. If it doesn't come from within the population, right, then the system is an exploitive system. Or if it disproportionately harms the poor or the exploited, as in the example that she gives of the people who are working at the railway station, who are cleaning up after the nearly 1 million people who pass through there every day, right? Then part of what she's doing is she's saying the outcome of this is racist. If it's supported by one class of women, one class of people, the white professional class, for example, and it doesn't address the inequalities that are experienced by the other classes, the people who clean the train stations, the people who make my tennis shoes, who are more likely to be people of color, to be people of immigrants, to be people who live in places in the world that are exploited by others to produce our goods cheaply, right? Then the conclusion that she draws is that it's a racist system that props up the white, heteronormative, that is, the system that privileges the male and female relationship over queer LGBTQ sorts of relationships, other kinds of family structures, and that props up the patriarchal structures that have dominated Western Europe and the United States for millennia, right? Even if it carries with it the language of feminist opportunity and freedom, it may not be that. So the Verges work is a more difficult work, I think, than the other three, but it's an important voice for us to hear and consider. There may be parts of it that you get on with and say, that makes sense, and parts of it that you want to argue with. That's fabulous. That'll give us something to talk about in class. So thanks for watching this, and we'll go ahead and look forward to our discussion here next week.